As I mentioned in the last video, the most common form of culture hero is coyote in the indigenous traditions, and this story here kind of gathers all of the principal elements of a coyote story. A long time ago, the country along the Thompson River east of Lytton was inhabited by the Coyote people. The surrounding country to the east and south was also occupied by them, but they were probably more numerous around Spence's Bridge and the immediate neighborhood than any other place. The chief of these people was the Old Coyote. He was great in magic. No person could vanquish him or kill him, and it was said that he could never die. Although magically so powerful, yet he was often made a dupe by other people. He was always trying to do things beyond his power and to imitate others and generally failed in such attempts. Although he sometimes proved himself to be very simple and easily taken in, yet on the whole he was wise, crafty, cunning, selfish, and deceitful. He traveled around the country a great deal from place to place. He had many wives, most of whom he obtained by trickery or in some unusual manner. He used to dress in alkali grass. So the story of Coyote as a very ambiguous character. Obviously, we mentioned that it was a trickster, a shapeshifter, and we're gonna see a few more of those today. But it is interesting to see that it is very much part of the character of Coyote itself. That Coyote is both craft and wise and cunning, but also deceitful. And of course, there's a very fine line to be towed here between being crafty and deceitful, and between being wise and selfish, and some stuff that may seem to be more or less incompatible in many ways, but also kind of feeding into one another. So the definition of this coyote character really has to do with the things that are considered to be important to those who are telling us the story, and those who circulated the stories among themselves as part of their lives. And so this other example here said that's from Boaz himself in part of Thompson, which is another American folklore society compendium. The series of adventures in which the culture hero appears as a dupe or trickster is found over a large part of the continent. The central character changes from one culture area to another, and some of the adventures have a narrow distribution, but one cycle fades so imperceptibly into another, and so many motifs are common to several cycles as it is impossible to arrange the adventures in definite groups. An exception to this statement is the threefold cycle of the North Pacific coast, containing the adventures of Raven, Blue Jay, and Mink. So yesterday we mentioned Blue Jay. These adventures merge so as to form a rather definite series. And so Boaz, for example, gathered a bunch of these Coyote stories and a bunch of the Raven stories, and so that allows one to compare and contrast the meaning of them. In other parts of the country as well, it is possible to recognize certain rather vaguely defined cycles of tales. In nearly all cases, the foolish adventures happen to the culture hero, who thus plays a double role in the mythology. Going from east to west, one may recognize the following heroes of trickster tales: Glooskap of the Northeast Algonquins, Flint and Sapling of the Iroquois, Manabozho and Whiskajak of the central woodland, corresponding in general to the Iktomi of the Sioux, Lakota, Rabbit of the southeastern tribes, Coyote of the plains, Plateau, and California tribes, Mink, Blue Jay, and Raven of the North Pacific. Notes on the prominent of the adventures follow for an adequate consideration of the distribution. Each incident must be treated separately. So it is quite clear that to make sense out of these different stories, they have to be taken into context. Otherwise, it is almost impossible to make sense out of what this is to be a trickster, because from the point of view of an outsider, anything or everything can be a matter of wise and cunning. But these series are telling us about um, a very specific event or moral idea. Thompson here uses the vocabulary of cycles. So mythological cycles are just the way that we group mythology, generally speaking. So there's going to be different cycles depending on where you are. Irish folklore has its own cycles. I mean, every different group we're talking about here has these cycles that are kind of stories organized around a theme, essentially. Depending on the folklore, there will be the coyote cycle, the raven cycle, etc. So this is just a way to attempt to organize them. But as they pointed out here, it is very difficult to make sense of it. But to use a specific example from Thompson, the Manabojo, mentioned in the previous slide, again from the Bureau of American Ethnology report. When Manabojo had accomplished the works for which Keisha Manito had sent him down to earth, he went far away and built his wigwam on the northeastern shore of a large lake, where he took up his abode. As he was alone, the good Manitos concluded to give him for a companion his twin brother, whom they brought to life and called Nakpote, which signifies an expert marksman. He was formed like a human being, but being a Manito, could assume the shape of a wolf, in which form he hunted for food. Manabosho was aware of the anger of the bad Manitos who dwelt beneath the earth, and warned his brother, the wolf, never to return home by crossing the lake, but always to go around along the shore. So the story is quite clear here of this character who is the brother of the human, and who has a clear directive to not cross the lake because of the impending danger. And so, of course, Manabosho himself is here, or is as part of our stories to tell us the tale of what happens if you do cross the lake, if you do cross the interdiction. And more importantly for us at this point in time, we have Manabozho, the wolf brother. So this is a character that is a good hunter, as some people may be, but he also assumes the shape of a wolf to hunt. So this is a shapeshifter. This is a character that turns from a wolf into a human, like perhaps a werewolf, like perhaps a Wendigo for the Anishinaabe, for the Rougarou in France and Louisiana. Genu of the Micmac. There's all kinds of characters that transform into wolves and back again, but obviously the werewolf is the most common way that we describe these things. Again, this is a pretty typical trope of folklore, and one that has, however, a much simpler, or a much more direct explanation than an idea of the full moon, of whatever the contingencies are for our werewolves. Um, oh, there it is. So these stories are obviously to be taken in their context, both geographically and culturally, because crossing a lake may have a very different relevance depending on what is on the other side of the lake. And here we have the story of the bad characters living beneath the earth. So knowing that there is something that is kind of below the surface is certainly also a pretty common trope, but in the context of people living in very specific areas, we can also ask ourselves whether these wolfmen, these shape-shifting people, could be also part of our story of understanding danger and understanding what is happening in our world. For example, Le Chid culture hero called Chakwa, part of a dialect continuum in the Pacific Northwest. This particular character here, an identified group living in the Cascades near Tulalip, meaning vicious wild people, some kind of monster, also close to a forest dwarf, for also sometimes the Eskimo, so Inuit North people, essentially again from the other side of the lake, maybe from the other side of the water. nocturnal beings who take care of plants and trees in the last shape of this Chakwiks. Um, this character, which exists in the Pacific Northwest, and that has a trickster role here to take care of plants, but also some kind of monster. So, what is it? Is it a human? Is it a dwarf? Is it just a neighbor? Is it just another group? Is it another name by which you can know him? Perhaps Saskitz. A giant came to Union Bar. The people were living in the large wooden house. The giant leaned his back against the side of the house and shook it violently. Some men ran out to see what was the matter and saw a man who was exceedingly tall. The people were afraid, but he did not harm them. Saskitz the giant, from the Salishan tribe, an account that it dates back to Lewis and Clark. Once again, in the Pacific Northwest, a hairy giant that lives in the woods that doesn't seem to want to hurt anyone, but some people have seen, but also that seems to be able to change shapes. You get where this is going. In the late 19th century, all of these stories of wild men of the woods that turn up in various places, here from the Lansing Republican, so Lansing, Michigan, the plains. The wild man has now turned up as far away as Nevada. Like the sea serpent, he appears from time to time in different parts of the continent, and the stories which the country papers get up about him are always wonderful and awful. Wonderful and awful, like the story of Sasquatch, whether it is a character that exists in European folklore or in the indigenous folklore or at the crossroads of the two, is really where we can find the roots for these things. And you could say, perhaps, if you will, that at this point in time, especially, Sasquatch is somewhat of a culture hero for a lot of people. This is the character that a lot of people put their hope in. This is this symbol of whether or not our science is doing its job, whether or not our environment is falling apart, whether or not we know about our past and perhaps how our future works. I mean, the lots of interpretations that we can put into Sasquatch are certainly to be found in the position of a trickster, of a culture hero, of any one of those characters that has an ambiguous definition in our folklore. One of the most recent such characters that also is associated with tricksters is Satan. Madame Blavatsky especially described Satan as a cultural hero, at least to herself. The devil is not a person, but a creative force, for good as for evil. They, the initiates, represented this force which presides at physical generation under the mysterious form of a god of or nature. So God Pan, or nature, whence the horns and the hoofs of what mythical and symbolic figure, as also the Christian goat of the witches' Sabbath. With regard to this too, Christians have imprudently forgotten that the goat was also the victim selected for the atonement of all the sins of Israel, and the scapegoat was indeed the sacrificial martyr. The symbol of the greatest mystery on earth, the fall into generation, only the Jews have long forgotten the real meaning of there to the non-initiated, ridiculous hero, selected from the drama of life in the great mysteries enacted by them in the desert, and the Christians never knew it. So, perhaps picturing such a character as Satan, a trickster figure that exists in some of the uh, kind of the hidden writings of the Bible, that figures in some of the more mystical interpretations of the Torah and the Old Testament, which, according to Blavatsky, again requires kind of a sort of a privileged knowledge to understand, but yet still kind of ticks all the boxes of the trickster characters that we can think of. Something that is both scary to some, but also appealing to some. And once again, the sexual appeal of Satan as this kind of a lurid character is something that many people are familiar with, conversely, Satan being also perceived as this person that is evil in the most unknowable of ways, creates this mix of wonder and awe. And in terms of our vocabulary, talking about the aspect of a curse, for example, a curse and a blessing used to be the same words. They were both a figure of awe, but at this point in time, the two words have differentiated themselves as one is good, one is bad. And a way in which we can make sense of our lives in a more or less good, more or less bad way if we have the right interpretation, the privileged interpretation, the one that is promoted by your culture, by your cultural group. Blavatsky says, with us, Satan, once he ceases to be viewed in the superstitious, dogmatic, unphilosophical spirit of the churches, grows into the grandiose image of one who made the terrestrial a divine man, who gave him, through the long cycle of Mahakalpa, the law of the spirit of life, and made him free from the sin of ignorance, hence of death. So it is possible to see Satan as the triggering element to our lives, not just the good part, but the bad part.